Hey peeps, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. Today I'm joined by a special guest, Dr. Trenton Merricks, to discuss ontological pluralism and the nature of existence. Don't worry, that sounds intimidating, but I promise we'll define terms and try to make things understandable. So Dr. Merricks is a professor of philosophy at the University of Virginia. He's most well known for his excellent work in metaphysics. He's published dozens upon dozens of peer-reviewed articles in several books, including Truth and Ontology, Objects and Persons, and Propositions. Y'all can find links in the description to his work, and in particular, his 2019 article in the journal Noose entitled The Only Way to Be. That's the article a good portion of our discussion will be focusing on. So Dr. Merricks, thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so for the audience, I will begin with outlining the structure of this video. So first, we're going to be looking at existence, like what it is. Second, we're going to be looking at definitions, which will set the stage for the third section, which is we're going to be discussing Merricks's dilemma for pluralism. And then fourth, we're going to be going into some objections. And then finally, we will conclude. So now let's go on to the first section on existence. And so the goal is really just to discuss the nature of existence, outlining the various views on offer, and exploring Merricks's reasons for holding the view that he does. So I guess my first two questions kind of naturally accompany one another. So first, what even is existence, and what are some of the main views of the nature of existence on offer?
Well, I'll tell you what my view is, and I think it's a pretty common view in kind of 20th and 21st century English-speaking philosophy, at least, and that is that you can't really define existence. You know, there's certain really basic concepts that we start out with that I think we can grasp and can say intelligent things about them, but we can't give a definition. So take, on the one hand, being a bachelor, and on the other, numerical identity. You might think you can define what it is to be a bachelor. You can say it's to be an unmarried man or an unmarried male or whatever, and then those can probably be further defined. But you might think that if I say that A is identical with B, the is identical or the is numerically identical with, I think most of my people, the English-speaking philosophers the past 100 years, think that numerical identity is this kind of fundamental primitive concept. We can't break it down into clearer, more basic parts, but we can still say a lot about it. We can say identity implies indiscernibility. We can say identity is intimately connected to counting. We can say a lot of things about it. It's transitive. I personally, and I think I'm not unusual nowadays, I think existence is like that. I can't really give you a definition, but I can kind of say some things, like I can say that identity is transitive. I could say, but that's not a definition, just a fact about it. I think I can say, you know, existence is kind of what has to be true of a thing before anything else can be true of it. You know, so if you say the spheres in the heavens are made of crystal, and I say, but there aren't any such spheres, then you shouldn't be saying they're made of crystal. You know, you have to exist to be made of crystal. So I guess I think existence just is, I mean, we can give you lots of synonyms. You know, unicorns exist just in case there are some, just in case I think this, just in case they're real. And so I don't know if that's helpful. And I'll say maybe one more thing. In first order logic, a lot of times we use the backwards E symbol to mark existence. And so we'll come back to that later. I'm just going to do a very silly write with pen on a piece of paper. I think we'll see. You can edit this out if it's ridiculous. Very high tech.
There we go. I like it.
So the way my people would read this is we would think that says there is some X, such that X is identical with X. That's kind of a logic way to write something exists. What I think is maybe relevant here is not everybody, but the vast majority of people who work in philosophy, I think, who would ever use a sentence like this, want to say that this is absolutely precise, that there's no vagueness in it, that it's, you know, it's kind of has mathematical, logical precision. And one reason why it's precise is because none of this can really be defined. So no vagueness can sneak into the via the definitions.
Yeah, that makes sense. Man, I should have, I told myself to make a mental note that I was going to wear my existential quantifier shirt. So I literally have a shirt and then it just has the existential quantifier on the front. And I told myself I need to wear it for this discussion.
Oh, that's great.
But I forgot.
There's a street sign in Syracuse, New York somewhere that shows kind of upcoming stretch of the street with 3 roads going off it. And it just looks like a backwards E.
Yeah.
And, back a long time ago when I used to have friends who taught there, we would pilgrimage up there to this neighborhood with this sign as the most holy site in Syracuse.
That's so great.
Yeah.
Oh man. Okay. So yeah, we've sort of gestured towards what existence is, and now I kind of want to look at some of like the main views on offer. So, you know, one view is that it's a sort of first order property. It's a property of individuals. Another view is that it's a second order property. So it's like a property of properties. That would be Frege's view. And, you know, the first order view would be perhaps more like I know Aquinas, for instance, held that it's an act of existence, or esse, which is a sort of metaphysical principle or causal property that an object has. So, and there are also anti-realist views on which there is no such thing as existence, although we might be able to predicate it of things. So can you sort of maybe take us through these views, or maybe which view you have?
I don't know if I can. I think maybe rather than speculate about some of that, maybe I'll try and reorient the conversation where I think it's most relevant to where you're going. And I think kind of what's most important is that, you know, if there are human beings, then human beings exist. And if there are pure sets exist. And then the really interesting question that, or at least the question that I've had some thoughts on that you wanted to talk about, is whether when I say human beings exist and pure sets exist, I'm saying the same thing about human beings as I'm saying about pure sets. To me, that's the question I have some thoughts on, whether what I'm saying is that sets have this property, the property of existing, or instead whether I'm saying something else. I don't really even know what to say about it. Part of it has to do with definitional issues about like what's a property. So a Kantian, my understanding is Kant thought existence wasn't a property, but what he meant by a property was a thing that could divide things up into separate groups and it could differentiate things. But since he knew correctly that necessarily everything exists, 2 things can never differ with regard to whether they have that feature. So that was enough for him to say that's not a property. You know, but there are other ways you could use the word property where that would. So I'm uncomfortable with your question just because I think there's lots of different ways to unpack it. And what I'm really maybe most interested in is people who believe in Bigfoot say Bigfoot exists. People who don't say Bigfoot doesn't exist. So we know what it means to say of a thing that it exists or not. Maybe you don't think that the Loch Ness Monster exists, but then, you know, you're scuba diving in the unclear waters and you see it, and then maybe you change your mind. Well, you change your mind about what there is, about what exists. And I think we can understand that stuff well enough to have our conversation without asking whether it's a first order property or second order property or whatever. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think that's a perfect segue into our next section, which is defining terms and laying the foundation for the dilemma that you raised for pluralism. So so on to the next section for the audience. We're basically just going to define terms and allow you guys in the audience to follow along. So actually for this, because we're about to get into quantification, I am going to try to share my screen. So let me see if I can do this. Share screen, Google Chrome. Let's first try to define way of being. This might be like the first time, the first existence question that I asked you, because it's difficult to define way of being. But is there anything you can say about it that can kind of illuminate what a way of being or a mode of existence is for our audience?
You know what? Can we start with number 2 and then do number 1?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
So let's start with the idea of generic existence. So the way I think things are, and the way maybe a lot of people, at least in English-speaking philosophy, the past 100 years have thought things were, not everybody, is the idea that when you say like a pure set, so a pure set is a set that has either nothing or other sets as members. If you say a pure set exists, and you say your dog exists, and you say your house exists, that you're using, that you're saying the same thing about all of those things, that the word exists there has the same content. So that you could say a pure set exists, my dog exists, and you could also say a pure set and my dog exists. That would be okay. Whereas if you said, the sky is blue and, I'm blue, meaning you're feeling sad, it probably wouldn't be okay to say the sky and I am blue. So the thought was, or one thought is that when we talk about things existing, it's generic in the sense that everything, every kind of thing that there is exists in this way. So maybe that's generic existence. And then way of being or mode of existence really is supposed to say, I believe historically began by saying there is no such thing as generic existence. Instead, there's existence, we can call it existence sub 1, and dogs have that, and existence sub 2, and abstract objects like pure sets have that. And then maybe there's other kinds too. But I kind of think that the easiest way into ways of being or modes of existence is to see it as a rejection of generic existence. Now we're going to come back and you can combine these. That's possible. It's a possible view. But the easiest way into it is to begin by thinking, when you start to say there's this thing, generic existence, that, if there were a Bigfoot, it would have. If there are dogs, they have it. If there are sets, they have it. And then to see ways of being or modes of existence is kind of denying that. And to say instead, when you say numbers exist, and then you also add chairs exist, the thought is, if you're a way of being person, you're gonna be like, yeah, but they exist in very different senses, such that it would be either false or incoherent or a bad joke to say numbers and chairs exist.
Yeah. And I guess for the audience, note that this is not merely saying that, they have very different properties, or they have,
right,
they have very different attributes, or we predicate very different things of them. They're saying they actually exist in different ways. It's a different kind, as it were, or type of existence of sorts. It's a different.
Yeah, and some opponents have claimed not to understand what that could be. I'm not going to rely on that. I'm going to grant, for the sake of argument, it's a sensible view. But I do sometimes kind of think, I don't even know what that would mean, Are there numbers? Yes. Are there chairs? Yes. Now we're done.
Yeah. I'm thinking I've got my Peter Van Inwagen existence, essays, and ontology right there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, in defense of ways of being, there's a lot of things Peter Van Inwagen doesn't understand. So,
okay, so for the audience, we just went through generic existence. It's basically the existence, or so the thought goes, it's the existence that everything enjoys. It's just this single, numerically one and the same existence that tables and chairs and sets and trees and dogs and human beings and God and Cartesian egos, if they exist, all these different sorts of things enjoy. And a way of being is just a different mode of existence, a different sort of kind or type or what have you of existence. And as
maybe can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
It's really important that a way of being, as we're using it here, is not merely a restriction on generic existence.
Yeah.
Like everybody agree, people who believe, monists, people who believe there's just generic existence, that's the only kind of existence, agree that we could define up terms. We could say, exists of one, and I could say that just means A, generically exists, and B, is abstract. Or exists sub 2, and that just means generically exists and is concrete. But if you're doing that, that's just restricting quantification, as we say. That's not introducing modes of being. So one reason maybe why I made the, slightly snarky, but, just kind of also genuinely slightly puzzled comment about not being sure what ways of being are, is because they're not that. So when you say there's this way of being that only abstract objects have, not concrete objects have, you're not saying it's existing and being abstract. I get that perfectly fine. It's this other thing that's supposed to be there.
Yeah, no, that's a good addition. And we should one final thing before we move on to defining monism and pluralism. But one more thing for the audience is that Dr. Merricks in his paper, he focuses on two different ways of existence, purportedly abstract and concrete modes or ways of existence, but there are different ways that pluralists might cash out their view. So an Aristotelian pluralist might say, well, there's a substantial way of existence, and then the different categories, the 9 other categories, have their own mode or way of being. And you know, maybe a Thomist would go a different way and say, oh, well, God has his own mode of being or existence with which he's identical, and then creatures have different creaturely modes of being. So like there are different ways to cash out pluralism. It's not just maybe an abstract versus concrete divide. So
the reason I like talking about the abstract concrete is it's just easy. There's 2. And if I had to walk through every Aristotelian category, and I don't know, maybe fight with somebody about how many categories there are, or whatever. So, but yeah, everything you said, Joe, is completely right. Yeah.
Okay. So we defined generic existence and way of being or mode of existence. We'll both probably, use those interchangeably throughout, way of being versus mode of existence. But now we're going to move on to monism and pluralism. So can you define those for us?
Monism about being is the view that there's just one kind of existence. And since everything exists, it's generic existence. And then pluralism about being is the view, well, it's perhaps the view that there is no generic existence, but instead multiple kinds. So existence sub 1, existence sub 2, and so on. It might be, some people have said more recently, so Chris McDaniel, I guess, is really the person who jumps to mind here, has said, we can combine existence sub 1 and existence sub 2 also with there being generic existence. But pluralism, really, you could think of it as is just denying that everything generically exists, and moreover, that's all there is to say about how things exist.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So probably now these are important concepts for the dilemma that we're going to pose for pluralism. So we got quantification, universal quantification, and existential quantification. And in particular, I know we're probably going to want to say something about quantification first, but I also want to point out that we need to make a distinction here between a truly universal quantifier, like a generic universal quantifier, versus a universal-like quantifier, and same with existential quantifiers for the audience. So we'll get to that, but maybe you could just say something. What is quantification for us, because it's a fancy word?
Yeah, I mean, quantification is just the way philosophers talk about making claims about some general group of objects. So if I say, there are some birds in the forest, I've quantified over the birds in the forest. and I've, in fact, existentially quantified over them, because I said there are some. If instead I say all the birds in the forest have feathers, then I've universally quantified over birds. I've said all the birds are such that they have feathers. One funny thing about, I'll just maybe leave it there before we get to actually talking about quantifiers. But quantification, you can think of it when we say some or every or all, we're already quantifying.
Yeah.
And then philosophers have introduced logical symbols to help make it more precise and maybe more concise, certain claims about quantification.
I think that is a good sort of transition to where I can put these on screen.
Yeah.
So can you take us through, like, what is this upwards, upside down A, and then what is this backwards E, and how are they interdefined?
So the upside down A is the universal quantifier that suggests that you're about to make a claim to the effect that every something or all somethings. The backwards E is the existential quantifier that indicates you're making a claim about some entity, some object. So existential exists. That's the idea. Universal, well, universal suggests every. So you could think of them as the every and the sum quantifier if you wanted to. Mm-hmm. So ax f of x, that just says every x is an f. And that's really just a kind of logic-y way to write this sentence. Everything is an f. Mm-hmm. The little tilde, the squiggly line there is symbol for not. And so on the other side, the IFF, which is if and only if, you get it's not the case that, or it is false that there is something that's not an F. Mm-hmm. And the way they're interdefined, well, if everything is on Earth, then it's false that that something's not on Earth.
Yeah, I gave the example of red there. Yeah, so everything is red if and only if.
Yeah, it's not the case that something is non-red.
Yeah.
And so, it's a little bit hard, but if you think about it, you can maybe see that if I want to say, everything is red, I could also say this, it's false that something's not red. Mm-hmm. And they amount to the same thing. That's the sense in which they're interdefined.
Yeah. And then, you can it goes both directions as well. You could do some formal manipulation and you'll be able to say that there is an X such that X is F, if and only if it's not the case that everything is not F, right? So something is red, just in case, not everything is non-red. So something is red.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So that's sort of the interdefinability of existential universal quantifiers. We talked about what a quantifier is, and we went through these two little quantifiers. And now we should, briefly before we go on, we should probably touch on the distinction between a generic existential quantifier, existential like quantifier, and same with a universal. So
I guess the thought is when I say something is red, if you believe in generic existence, that's going to be equivalent to something that generically exists as red. Mm-hmm. And so it's pretty, if you believe that everything exists in the same way, then you can take the backwards E to always mean exists in that way. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if I don't believe in generic existence, and I think there are two different kinds of existence, one for, just to keep the easiest case, abstract objects, and another for concrete, non-abstract objects, then when I say something is prime, and I'm thinking of a prime number there, mm-hmm. In a way, like, is that true or is that false? And the answer, if you're this kind of a ways of being person who thinks there's only existence for abstracta or existence for concreta, they're going to say something is prime isn't really well formed. Mm-hmm. It's got to be something sub one, where maybe existence sub one is the kind of existence abstract objects has. That'll be true. But something sub two is prime will be false because no concrete object is prime. And so the thought is, once you've got, if you're only, and you've highlighted this sentence, that's great. Is this from me or is this from you?
No, this is for me. I scrolled down. Okay, I wanted to allow people to see what the existential like quantifier is with the little subscript in contradiction to the generic existential.
Yeah. And the point is not to introduce new fancy logic terms just to make things harder. The point is that if you're a ways of being person and you think there's only existence one and existence two, then a sentence like, and again, I'm using primes, like a prime number, like 7 or 5. A sentence like this will be ill-formed. You'll be like, what do you mean by some X? Do you mean existence one or existence two? Yeah. And, and I say, is this true or false? A ways of being person should say, there is no answer to that question. You haven't said anything yet. Mm-hmm. I do this, and now I've said something. And I can't remember if existence one is for abstract objects, then I've said something true. If it's for concrete, I've said something false. Yeah. So the point is, if you're going to use these existential and universal quantifiers, you don't believe in generic existence, then you're not going to want, then you're going to want to have quantifiers corresponding to each way of existence.
Yeah, sweet. Okay, so that was the sort of definitions section. We went through the existential universal quantifiers. We did the distinction between universal-like quantifiers and generic quantifiers. And so, yeah, I think, is there any other terms just in definitionally that you want to cover, or should we move on?
I'm not sure. I kind of think it might make more sense to define things as we need them.
Yeah, I think
from here on out, as opposed to pile up a bunch of definitions,
yeah, yeah.
and then have to remember them. I think we're okay.
Okay, good. So I'm actually just going to keep this shared screen so the audience can follow along. I think that would be good. Okay, so now we're on to section 3. We are on to Merricks's dilemma for pluralism. Okay, so I will read this and then I will turn it over to you. So here's a rough sketch of the dilemma before I turn it over to you to maybe explain it for, in more lucid terms. So the dilemma is as follows. Either the pluralist accepts generic existence or not. That is, either the pluralist says that everything enjoys a generic way of being, in addition to the more specific ways of being, or not. But neither horn is good news for pluralism. The first horn, on which pluralists accept generic existence, faces at least 3 serious problems. But the second horn, and we'll get to those problems, but the second horn, on which pluralists reject generic existence, renders pluralists unable to state their view and hence unable to accept it. And clearly, if they cannot by their own lights accept their view, well, then surely everyone should not accept their view. And so I just want to focus on the first horn for this particular portion. I go on to discuss the second horn down here, but let's just focus on the first horn, on which pluralists accept generic existence. So what are the sort of problems that result from this? I know you give 3 in your paper, but could you walk us through these and perhaps any others that you've come across?
Yeah, I'll give you the 3. And we'll see if you want to follow up. And most people who have objected to this paper seem to want to resist this horn of the dilemma and think generic existence isn't so bad. Mm-hmm. So far as I can tell, the second horn that we're going to talk about a little bit has been, at least in terms of emails I get and papers I've seen, tends to be pretty uncontroversial. So I think that's a little bit interesting. So, but my thought was that the main motivation, well, here's the first reason. I think the main motivation, and this is partly from stuff I've read, but also partly from having given this paper and heard the things that, pluralists, not of the most recent sort, but pluralists like Heideggerians or Aristotelians, so on, have said. I think, a main motivation for pluralism, and maybe the kind that you get, Chris McDaniel in his intro to his book on ways of being says this: undergrads always seem to endorse a sort of pluralism. And I think their idea, the undergrads and Russell in 1912 and Moore in 1903, and maybe lots of other people, has been, look, numbers are so different from, say, tables and chairs or dogs, that if there are numbers, maybe they exist, but not in the same sense that tables or chairs or dogs exist. The motivation for positing ways of being seems to me a kind of reasoning that you could object to, but the reasoning is basically these things can't exist in the same sense. And so I don't really know what, I think it's Ryle's view. I haven't looked at this enough, but, Ryle has this comment where if you say, armies exist and Wednesdays exist, maybe that's okay. But if you say armies and Wednesdays exist, that's just absurd because they just don't exist in the same sense. So if you're motivated by pluralism, by this insight or alleged intuition or conviction or commitment that there's no way, if there are numbers, that they exist in the sense in which physical objects exist, then of course you're committed to the view that it's false that numbers exist in a sense in which physical objects exist. But if you believe in generic existence, you're saying there is a sense of existence in which numbers and physical objects exist. So I kind of think there's, it just kind of guts the view of what motivates it in the first place for a lot of people, at least before, before the early 21st century.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And I remember reading that. I was like, yeah, I mean, that does seem like, why else would someone posit ways of being if not to, either capture or account for, these really seeming radical differences between numbers and chairs, say, like, if you say both of them that they exist in the exact same sense, they have some one and the same generic being, as it were. Yeah, why go further? Why? I know we're about to talk about Van Inwagen and how he's like, listen, all you need is different properties to account for that. But so I think that's enough by way of the first problem. Do you want to go on?
Yeah. So the first problem is, we could summarize it as the motivation for pluralism, which is it's false that these things exist in the same way. But then generic existence says they do exist in the same way, plus some other stuff. Yeah. And then the second one is, there's a pretty common objection to pluralism, and that is it's confused difference in properties, features, and kinds with difference in existence. And so you mentioned Van Inwagen. Van Inwagen he calls it a rant against Russell. And he's like, no, numbers and, physical objects are really, really, really different. And you can list their differences. Some of them are abstracts, others aren't. Some of them are located in space and time, others aren't. Some of them have a mass, others don't. You can list all the really, really deep differences between them. Van Inwagen's claim is, once you've done that, like, there's nothing left to be done by adding, and they exist in different senses. And, whether that's a good argument or not, whether you find that persuasive or not, I think you should find the following argument even more persuasive. So give Van Inwagen's argument whatever persuasiveness points you want on a scale of 1 to 10. I think the following argument will be at least, 5 points even more persuasive. And that is, if you say that numbers and pieces of furniture both generically exist, so they have that in common. They both exist in the same way. They have that in common, but they differ in that one of them has center of gravity and the other doesn't. One of them is spatially located and the other isn't. Excuse me, and so on. And you get that long list, then it really does seem like, and then why would you add? Oh yeah, and also these things that exist in the same way and differ in all these properties also, moreover, exist in other ways too. And I guess my thought, which is, pretty strong, is that, I think this, I definitely think this. My thought is that, look, Van Inwagen's original argument definitely has something to it. And it's not just his, like, that's the kind of, there's a knee-jerk reaction to ways of being, it's that. And I think that argument just gets strengthened when the pluralist starts out by saying they exist in the same ways generically, and they differ with all these properties. And then it's just like, well, why do they have to have different existences now?
Yeah. No, I think that is more persuasive. It's like, once you add in to Van Inwagen's analysis, that, because we're on this horn of the dilemma, once you add in that the pluralist is indeed accepting generic existence, it's like, it becomes all the more odious, it seems. So
and then right. And then you might, And then I guess the third reason is just looking at historical reasons people have given for pluralism, and arguing that generic existence isn't consistent with those historic pre-Jason Turner, pre-Chris McDaniel versions of, thousands of years versions of pluralism. I'll just maybe allude to one and say a little more about another. You might think Aristotle's stuff, his arguments, his reasons for thinking being is not a genus and existence is not univocal and so on. You might think that those arguments give some reason to oppose monism and endorse pluralism. I just want to say those reasons, if they were any good, would also be perfectly good reasons to oppose generic existence. because, if generic existence is supposed to be a genus, then the things that are differentiated under the Aristotelian picture are all going to be differentiated by properties that also generically exist, but that's supposed to be against the rules for being in genus. I don't know where the rules come from, but the arguments do seem to depend on that. So, generic existence seems completely inconsistent with that kind of reasoning for pluralism. Or if you think about, I read Aquinas and Maimonides, maybe Avicenna as a pluralist about existence, and their reasons. I'll just give you, one version of it. The thought is, and you get this even now, pluralism is still, I think, kind of minority view in philosophy. In theology, it's a lot more common. And I remember being at a party with a bunch of religious studies people, and a lot of them were apophatic theologians, and part of that, and they were really insistent that it was idolatrous to say that God exists in a sense in which we exist, because then God is like just one of us. And, maybe you get that in Maimonides, and maybe you sort of get it in Aquinas. So it's not like it's and maybe it's in Avicenna, I can't remember. And so the thought is, Aquinas is like, look, and there's other reasons for Aquinas. He thinks God's identical with God's existence. We're not identical with God's existence, because then we'd be identical with God. Then our existence would be identical with God. That's out for Aquinas. And of course, because of Aquinas' views about divine simplicity, if God enjoyed generic existence, God would be identical with generic existence as well. So you get the same kinds of reasons to deny that us and God could generically exist. One from divine simplicity, and then a second from the idea that predicates applied to God are not univocally applied to us. And generically exists is a predicate. Yeah. So if you find divine simplicity or worries about that motivate apophatic theology, or worries about idolatry and so on to motivate pluralism about being such that God exists in a way different from we do, they equally well motivate, in my opinion, the denial that we and God are alike with regard to generically existing. Now, one caveat, Aquinas, if I remember correctly, and I think Maimonides as well, allow us to maybe predicate negative properties to God and us. So maybe it's literally true that God's not a toaster, and it's literally true that you're not a toaster. Negative properties are okay. Maybe relational properties. I kind of think this is the way to understand Aquinas' 5 ways. He's at least in part saying, we can predicate certain things of God, like the first cause. It's a relational property. That's fine. But generic existence isn't negative or relational. I know that some people have wanted to say, in the kind of new versions of pluralism, maybe we say, no, Aquinas is only opposed to predicating univocally fundamental properties to us and God. And that's kind of the move you would make with the new versions of pluralism, the McDaniel and Turner version. My own view is Aquinas is explicit that we can't predicate wisdom to both us and God univocally. And that is definitely not a fundamental property. If I understand what a fundamental property is in these debates, human beings being wise is definitely not going to be fundamental. So I don't think that the motivations behind Aquinas are really to be restricted just to fundamental properties. Otherwise, talking about wisdom and goodness and so on. I don't know, if a person's good, that's probably not a fundamental property about them. A person's good in virtue of some other things, I would think. But
yeah, okay. So those are the 3 reasons. This last one was basically most, maybe not most, but a lot of the historical motivations for pluralism are equally going to be ruling out generic existence. And so the the difficulty for this first horn on which the pluralist accepts generic existence is like, listen, you're gutting the historical motivations for your view. Moreover, in the first objection or the first problem that we raised, it was like, it seems to be gutting some of the other, the principal reasons. And we also looked at the one from Van Inwagen, and your compounded +5 points of persuasiveness on that. So those are the 3 problems that arise from that first horn on which pluralists accept generic existence. I think we can probably move to the second horn now. Okay, so on the second horn, pluralists reject generic existence. Now, the trouble with this horn, you, Dr. Merricks, argue, is that it renders pluralists unable to state their view. Now, the basic idea, I take it, is as follows, and I'm going to follow your lead by using 2 ways of being pluralism as an example. And for ease of verbal exposition, I'm going to express their 2 modes or ways of existence as 1 existence and 2 existence. But the points apply to other pluralisms as well. You can just run them with the other ways of being that they have too. Okay, so without generic existence, 2 ways of being pluralists are left only with 1 existence and 2 existence, and their corresponding existential-like quantifiers, E sub 1 and E sub 2. Now, given the interdefinability of existential and universal quantifiers, 2 ways of being pluralists are then left only with the universal-like quantifier A sub 1 and the universal-like quantifier A sub 2 in terms of their universal-like quantifiers. They don't, therefore, have a fully general universal quantifier. But in that case, 2 ways of being pluralists cannot state that everything, full stop, with perfect generality, is thus and so. And so they cannot state their view, namely the view that everything either 1 exists or 2 exists, and insert your other ways of being if you have a pluralist like that. In other words, 2 ways of being pluralists cannot state that everything is thus and so, and hence cannot state their view. And they cannot state that everything is thus and so because they don't have a truly universal quantifier. For having that quantifier would entail having the simple, standard, generic existential quantifier, given the interdefinability of the universal existential quantifiers, which in turn expresses or captures generic existence, right? It says there exists rather than there 1 exists or there 2 exists or either there 1 exists or 2 exists. But as we saw, pluralists should reject generic existence. And so they don't have that truly universal quantifier, and so they can't state their view. Okay, I know it's a bit complicated for the audience. We're in some deep waters, but maybe you can add to this summary or maybe clarify things. I'll turn it over to you.
So the thought is, suppose I say not that everything exists, that everything, suppose I'm not saying this, everything whatsoever either exists sub 1 or exists sub 2. Right now, we're pretending they can't say that because they don't have any kind of universal quantifier. But instead, I say everything sub 1 exists sub 1, and everything sub 2 exists sub 2. That's equivalent to saying if something exists sub 1, then it exists sub 1, and if something exists sub 2, then it exists sub 2. Then what I've said is completely trivial. Like, no one should disagree with it. Monists should agree with it because it's trivial. 3 ways of being people should agree that everything that exists sub 1 exists sub 1, and everything that exists sub 2 exists sub 2. So the first thought that this view doesn't state 2 ways of being pluralism, which is a substantive controversial view, is that it doesn't state anything substantive or controversial. It's just completely trivial.
Yeah, I actually put that in here. I wanted to come in, because I have this view written out for people if they want to see it. So, because right now you're considering a proposal for stating pluralism after the general statement, and yeah, you say one of the proposals is that everything that 1 exists, so this is the universal sub 1 quantifier, everything that 1 exists, either 1 exists or 2 exists, and everything that 2 exists, either 1 exists or 2 exists. I know I kind of cut you off, but I just want this for the audience because it's really helpful. Yeah. And the reason why someone might think that this is a good approach initially is that, right, 2 ways of being pluralists, after all, think that everything either 1 exists or 2 exists. And so by their lights, at least, making a claim about all the entities in the domains of each of those universal-like quantifiers, that leaves nothing out.
And that's 100% right, yeah. And so you might wonder, how can you make a claim by your lights about everything without even by your lights, making a claim to the effect that everything is a certain way? Let me give you an example. Suppose I'm a solipsist, And so I believe that I'm the only thing that exists. And so I state the claim, I am conscious. I think I've made a claim about everything because I think I'm the only thing. But even I don't think I've said everything is conscious.
Yeah.
I recognize that I am conscious is consistent. It doesn't contradict the claim that there is a rock and it is not conscious. And so I recognize that I am conscious doesn't imply there are no non-conscious rocks. But the claim that everything is conscious does imply there are no non-conscious rocks. So even though I, the solipsist, believe I've made a claim about everything when I say I am conscious, even I don't think I've made the claim that everything is conscious. And that's kind of surprising, but you can kind of see it with that example.
Yeah.
And you can see why somebody would think, well, he's a solipsist, so by his lights, he's just said that everything is conscious. And really the answer is no, because it doesn't have the right entailments. It doesn't entail there are no rocks.
Exactly.
What I've said by my lights is that I am conscious. I also believe something else, that if I added to it, I am the only thing, then we'd be in business. But for the pluralists, they have to add the only things are the things that exist sub one and exist sub two, but that's a claim using a universal quantifier, the only things or all the things.
Yeah, you're saying everything either one exists or two exists, and that's all the ways of being that there are. You essentially have to say that, and that's the truly universal quantifier. You're quantifying over.
Yeah. You got to add that thing, and that's all the ways there are. Yeah.
That example with solipsism is really good. In your paper, I think you give an example of maybe blue things or red things or something. But I'm going to be honest with you, I kind of like the solipsism example better. It's really clear.
All right. Well, if I could change the past, I'd use that one instead.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the problem with that proposal. It's just trivial, right? Even monists can accept this. I mean, it's
trivial, and moreover, it doesn't say what you might be tricked into thinking it's saying. It doesn't say everything either exists in one or exists in two.
Exactly. Okay, so maybe I can try to push back. Maybe the pluralists can supplement one. And so, for instance, maybe we could add to one the claim that something one exists and something two exists. Then it's no longer a kind of tautology. It's no longer trivial.
Right. It's not trivial, but it still has the second problem.
Yeah. And so you basically point out that it fails to state two ways of being pluralism because a pluralist, for instance, who accepts one existence and two existence and another particular form of existence, someone we might call like a three ways of being pluralist, they can accept that modified thesis. And so someone who denies two ways of being pluralism can actually accept that thesis, in which case it doesn't state two ways of being pluralism.
Yeah.
Okay, so that, yeah, it falls really to the same problem. You have to rule out, and those are the only two ways of being that there are, and that requires the truly universal quantifier. And so I guess, the same problem afflicts this other proposal, right? The proposal that you can add to one that there are exactly two ways of being. Because in order to say that there are exactly two ways of being, you have to say there's this way of being, and then there's that other way of being, and these are all the ways of being that there are, right? And you need that latter conjunct requires a universal quantifier.
Yeah. So I start with trying to state two ways of being because I think it's a easy to wrap your mind around example of where a certain kind of pluralist needs to quantify over everything, but where they can't. Mm-hmm. And so it shows a problem with their being unable to quantify over everything. And that's a problem because now they can't state their view. Mm-hmm. But I actually think the problem is deeper than just that. So suppose you're not a two ways of being pluralist. Suppose you're at least two ways of being pluralist. So your view is not that there are exactly two ways of being, it's instead that there are at least two ways of being. Then you might be perfectly happy with that last thing you put up there, where you add something exists sub one and something exists sub two. And you're like, the three ways of being pluralists can accept that. And you're like, sure, my view, there are at least two ways of being is consistent with 3 ways of being and 4 ways of being. And so now the question should be, well, should anything here bother that person? And that person still has this result. That person is still unable to quantify over everything. That doesn't block their ability to state their view, which is non-specific ways of being, pluralism. But it does mean they can't quantify over everything. And why should they be bothered by that? Well, then they can't say things like, there are no unicorns. Why? Because that says everything is a non-unicorn. And then they can't say things like every dog is a mammal. And they can't say things like everything is not a 3-sided square. There's just all kind, if you can't, I mean, the easiest way to focus on it is think of something you don't believe in, suppose you don't believe in unicorns. Well, then it seems like it seems like if you're bereft of universal quantification, you're just completely unable to say that. I think this problem is particularly, I gave this paper once, that's why I was pushing back on it. I think this problem is particularly troubling for someone who's an atheist, because the atheist definitely wants to say God doesn't exist, but God, at least on the Thomistic way of thinking of it, exists in a way other than other things exist. So it seems like there's just like no way out. You can't just say God doesn't exist in the way that chairs exist. The Thomist is like, you're right, God doesn't. So I think, just to, we can focus on, and that's kind of how the paper starts, because I think it's kind of bite-sized and easy example to work with. Focus on stating 2 ways of being pluralism or 3 ways of being pluralism. But I think the big moral is without generic existence. The moral of that conversation generalizes to without generic existence, no pluralist can state truly universal claims of any sort. And that's really bad news, because we want to say things like, I don't mean to offend anyone. There is no Bigfoot, period. I could be wrong, but at least I want to be able to state it, Yeah. And of course we can state, I think that's just obvious, we can state that. I can believe that. Mm-hmm. It's hard to see how I could given pluralism without generic existence.
Yeah, it's nice. You're anticipating the next thing that I was going to say. I take it that this is what I say here. I take it that there is an underlying reason for the failure of these approaches.
Yeah.
It's precisely that they don't have that truly universal quantifier.
Not only is that the underlying reason, it also shows that the problem is even deeper than we've been focusing on. Exactly. It's not just for specific versions of pluralism.
Absolutely. And that shows why what we said earlier about the caveat, like, okay, we're focusing on 2 ways of being pluralism for simplicity. It shows why that. Yeah. Okay, so on to the objections. Okay. So yes, objection time. Okay, so this one will take just a little bit of spelling out, but you just bear with me, and the audience bear with me as well. Okay, so philosopher David Biles, in a 2019 article in the journal Analysis, I'm guessing you were one of the reviewers for this, but maybe. Anyway, in the journal Analysis entitled Pluralism, the Problem of Purity, raises an interesting criticism. And in particular, he targets that first horn on which pluralists accept generic existence, but accrue, by your lights, at least 3 serious problems. So Biles begins by noting that some predicates and properties are more natural than others. And so, at least as I understand natural, it's sort of like it carves nature at its joints. It's not gerrymandered. It's fundamental, right? It's not like built up out of or obtained in virtue of or constructed out of more fundamental things. And I guess it's also what I see people talk about is that it's projectable in the sense that it undergirds reliable inductive generalizations. But anyway, that's perfect. Well, perfectly natural predicate is one that carves nature at its most fundamental joints. So then Biles suggests that the pluralist should adopt what he calls pluralism star, or star pluralism, which is the thesis that while everything enjoys a generic way of being, only the various non-generic or specific ways of being are perfectly natural. So those are the fundamental ways of being, and then the generic way of being, or the generic mode of existence, is non-fundamental. So according to this view, the world itself makes a fundamental distinction between different modes of being that the monist is simply not capturing. Now, these guys can state their view since they accept generic existence, which is captured by the generic existential quantifier, which thereby delivers the desired generic universal quantifier. But importantly, the generic, universal, and existential quantifiers are not perfectly natural. They aren't fundamental. They don't carve nature at its most fundamental joints. They're a purely derivative way of being. Only the very specific ways of being are more fundamental. And I actually have this really nice quote that I want the audience, because this is very helpful for heuristic or for like pedagogical purposes. So he says, let's consider a less metaphysical case. Suppose, as physicists tell us, that all particles are either bosons or fermions. One might think that being a boson is a perfectly natural expression, and being a fermion is also a perfectly natural, fundamental expression. However, the generic notion of being a particle, that is, being a particle of some kind or other, is likely not perfectly natural or fundamental. But there clearly are particles in this generic sense. In addition, note that being some particle other is not merely the disjunction of being a boson or being a fermion. It was a substantive empirical discovery that all particles are bosons or fermions, not merely a definitional stipulation. So, just as one should think that there is some non-fundamental and not merely disjunctive sense in which there are generic particles, the star pluralist should accept that there is a non-fundamental and not merely disjunctive sense in which everything generically exists. And he goes on to say that star pluralists should not be worried by your three criticisms. So what do you make of this rejoinder?
It's funny. I don't really think of it as a rejoinder at all. I think he's just pointing out what people like Turner and McDaniel mean by saying generic existence would be non-fundamental. They definitely, I agree with this. They don't mean that it's disjunctive. If so, it wouldn't be generic existence. It would be
that we
yeah.
had.
So, and when I gave my original 3 objections to generic existence, I believe for what it's worth, I explicitly said, I mean these to apply even if generic existence is less fundamental. I guess I think it's telling that Builes uses pluralism star to describe the view, because it does seem to me quite different from the historic kinds of pluralism.
That's what I was thinking.
Again, and I would just say, Van Inwagen's argument against pluralism gets a real upgrade when the target's pluralism star, because, what's the motivation for saying there are these? So now you're not only saying there's existence 1, existence sub 2 in addition to generic existence, but now you're adding extra claims to the view, and they're more fundamental. And so maybe there are arguments or reasons to defend that kind of a view. I'm sure there are, but I don't think it undermines the objection I have here, in my opinion. So my objection never was that ways of being were superfluous, in the sense that we couldn't give an account of what they were that wasn't merely disjunctive. My objection was they strengthened Van Inwagen's style argument, and I still think that's true. I still think it's true that if pluralists don't respect the intuition or conviction or whatever, then that undermines the standard reason for being a pluralist of any sort.
Yeah.
And I still definitely think, and I think Builes acknowledges this, that the pluralist stars can't see themselves as in this grand metaphysical tradition of ontological pluralism, which is part of what maybe doesn't motivate modern views of pluralism, but are what perhaps give it its interest to make it seem cool.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's I like that. It was like a light bulb moment when you said, you're not saying that they're superfluous. You're just saying it sort of strengthens, it bolsters Van Inwagen's criticism, because they're accepting this generic way of being. So that was good. I like that. So I do I kind of want to hear what you think about his new challenge to pluralism. So for the audience, Biles does present a new challenge to pluralism that builds on his criticism of Dr. Merricks's dilemma. So his new challenge is basically the dilemma for the two ways of being pluralist star. Their claim that everything either one exists or two exists, and that everything denotes the generic universal quantifier. So for this claim is either a fundamental fact, this claim that everything either one exists or two exists, that claim is either a fundamental fact or not. Okay, if it's a fundamental fact, well then, since fundamental facts only contain fundamental notions or expressions, otherwise it wouldn't be fundamental, it follows that the expression generically exists in this claim is fundamental. And yet this is precisely what pluralism star denies, right? They need to have that kind of fundamentality of, if they're accepting this horn of the dilemma, they need the fundamentality of this truly universal quantifier of everything, which expresses, given interdefinability, generic existence with the generic existential quantifier. So, and yet that's precisely what pluralism star denies, that they would then thereby grant that generic existence is fundamental, which pluralism star says no. But now consider that other horn of the dilemma, on which the claim is not fundamental. Well, then there must be some sentence expressing a fundamental fact in virtue of which the claim is true. And this sentence can only contain fundamental notions, since fundamental facts only contain fundamental notions or expressions. And so this sentence cannot use generic, existential, and universal quantifiers, since those are non-fundamental under pluralism star. So the star pluralist must specify the truth conditions for the claim that everything either one exists or two exists that relies only on fundamental notions, meaning they cannot avail themselves of the generic universal quantifier, and yet that's precisely what they cannot do per the second horn of Dr. Merricks's dilemma. So what do you make of that new challenge? Do you think it kind of holds teeth even for the star pluralist?
So that challenge is really based in the context of certain views about fundamentality from Ted Sider, I think would be that's who Builes explicitly cites, and claims about purity and completeness and a bunch of really technical stuff, and a notion of in virtue of that isn't modal and stuff. So there's a lot going on there. I don't really know what to say about the details of this. Bradley Rettler has a nice paper and analysis trying to argue that this Builes's moves don't work. You guys could take a look at that and see what you think. I guess I think maybe I'll make some slightly more general claims that are germane, maybe a little easier to understand, but that don't go deep into the weeds on Sider's view about completeness and purity. The more general thing is, remember, so there's a problem not just for the two ways of being pluralist, but also for the non-specific pluralist, who just says, there are some things exist one and some things exist two. The stuff you've just read and the stuff, if I remember correctly, in Builes's paper, doesn't really talk about that. If he's really focusing on two ways of being pluralist in particular. Now, the more general problem that I think is the problem with two ways of being pluralism and also with non-specific pluralism is this idea that there's a failure of being able to universally quantify. And now we could maybe look at this way. Is there a worry about the fundamental being able to sanction or make true universal claims of universal quantification? So let me just give you an example why you might think there's a problem here. Suppose you say this. So suppose you say, like Jonathan Schaffer, the fundamental, maybe Sider uses this too, the fundamental is just like whatever God would have to create, and everything else follows. So maybe you think this, maybe you think, imagine a universe where God creates, so pretend there's nothing but God and what God creates. So God creates hydrogen atom A and hydrogen atom B, and then stops. It looks like all there is in that universe is hydrogen atom A and hydrogen atom B. That's all that's fundamental. Here's something that's true in that universe. There are not three hydrogen atoms. It doesn't look like hydrogen atom A makes that true, or hydrogen atom B, or hydrogen atom A and hydrogen atom B together. So already it looks like there's this worry for notions that the fundamental facts that everything's true in virtue of how the fundamental facts are. You have to add something like, and there's nothing else. Now, of course, that's not anything God had to do. So already you might wonder, and there nothing else, is that fundamental? And that's a really hard question. I mean, I'm inclined, I don't really go in for all of this. I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical about whether there's just one notion of fundamental and so on. But if I were, I would be really bothered by that. I would think all God has to do is make hydrogen atom A and hydrogen atom B. That looks like now we're done with creation. It seems like God doesn't have to then say out loud, and that's all there is. Nevertheless, it's not clear to me that hydrogen atom A and hydrogen atom B are enough to make it true that there are not three hydrogen atoms. There are exactly two. Why? Because their existence is consistent with there being three. Now, maybe you trot out some notion of in virtue of, where there are three are true in virtue of one and two. But now it feels like a little bit of magic is shoved into the in virtue of. So my own sense of, maybe if I was going to extend or explore the issues Builes raises, I would focus on non-specific pluralism, not so much specific, and really focus on whether we can make sense of claims that require universal quantification, like there are not three hydrogen atoms, there are exactly two, and what the fundamental has to be like in order to ground those things. And to me, that's super interesting, and it's tied into truth makers for negative truths, and it's tied into all kinds of really fun stuff. But that's where I think it's really interesting, and where people can make controversial moves. Some people might just say, well, once God did that, then it was true. So that's true in virtue of, but in virtue of isn't modal. So it doesn't matter that possibly those two atoms exist, and there are more than two. But now we're really, now it's getting really, it's getting weedy.
Yeah, exactly. And theses like truth maker, necessitarianism, and other sorts of things are coming in. It's like, yeah, you're really getting weedy, like you said. Okay, that's interesting with the pronunciation of his name. I did not know that. Builes. I love that.
I believe it's Builes. I believe it's yeah. I believe it.
I actually want to get him on my channel to discuss nominalism, because he has some interesting recent papers on it. I'm not a nominalist, but I'm interested to get his take on it. So yeah, and I actually plan to send this to him because I wanted him to see that we're engaging with his stuff. So good. Yeah. So, okay. I know we only have maybe 10, 15 more minutes left before we close this out, but maybe two more criticisms I'd like to take. So one of them is anti-realism. So maybe they could say the pluralist could challenge the claim, at least implicitly. And this is one that I actually sent you in the email. But perhaps the pluralist could challenge the claim, at least implicit in your dilemma, that having the generic existential quantifier would entail committing to or having or expressing generic existence. Perhaps they could say, au contraire, I have the generic existential quantifier, but I'm not committing to generic existence by dint of using it. I don't think there is such a thing as generic existence, but that doesn't stop me from using quantifiers. And they might also point out analogs with those who are anti-realist about ways of being. They not only reject pluralism, but also reject monism construed as a thesis that there is exactly one way of being. And yet surely they can use the existential quantifier, so the objection goes, for it need not entail commitment to a way of being corresponding to or captured by it. And if one is an anti-realist about generic existence, one could still take generically exists to be truthfully predicated of everything, just as the nominalist, despite not believing in triangularity, says that is triangular is truthfully predicated of triangles. And I do just want to give this analogy for the audience because I think it's helpful. So we can at least abstract the concept of redness from particular instances of red things, and then truthfully say that anything that has a certain degree of red in an RGB color scheme, so that's this color scheme right here for the audience, you guys can see it, They can say, truthfully, they predicate of various things in a univocal and generic sense that they are red. But it's also true that some things are, quote unquote, like redder than others. And there is something on the scale that is red in the most proper sense, namely 25500, the one right here, such that all red things are only red insofar as they are similar to something that is red in this proper sense of the word. And anything that is not read in this absolute sense is only read in a secondary and derivative sense. And it seems that one could say that only the various particular scale values correspond to properties that shared in common among things, whereas the kind of generic sense of red is merely a truthful predicate not corresponding to a property. Only the various particular scale values like 25500, 25510, those correspond to properties. But there is no single, extramental property or mode of existence, as it were. That's the analogy, right? So basically, in the same way, perhaps it is legitimate to hold that only the various particular or non-generic modes of being correspond to something in extramental reality shared in common among things. And as with the generic univocal predication of red, the aforementioned fact doesn't debar the in-principle legitimacy of truthfully predicating of various ways of being or of various individuals that exist in those ways that they generically exist. We're just not picking out any single commonly held or shared feature, say in extramental or extra-linguistic reality, by dint of such predication. So what do you think of that objection? I know it's a bit complicated, but
yeah, there's a lot there. I think I'm trying to remember. There's that Heidegger line that's in a footnote of my original paper. Being is not a being. I think so. One view you could have is that you shouldn't approach the pluralist monist debate by asking how many ways of being are there. That ways of being aren't entities of the sort you could count because they're not entities of any sort.
Yeah.
I'm perfectly fine with that view as far as this paper goes. Then the question just is, when you're truthfully predicating existence, as you are going to allow me, are you, when you say dogs exist and pure sets exist, are you predicating the same thing in each case? And then you got to figure out what you mean by truthfully predicating. But it's got to be something about the world. I would think a predication is truthful because of how things are.
Yeah.
And then we could, whether how things are is there is this entity, a way of being that's exemplified. All that kind of reminds me of your first question that I didn't want to answer. I don't know. So I would say, if somebody denies that ways of beings are entities, then the way to understand pluralism is not that there are two of them. It's rather to understand the idea that when we predicate existence of numbers, we're predicating something different than when we predicate existence of dogs.
That's interesting. So you can sort of run the argument just in terms of what we're predicating of things. And then
yeah. In fact, I think, as long as you just give me quantifiers, I can run the whole argument of the paper, and you could just delete that one section on counting ways of being. That in the end, if you remember from the paper, I don't know if you do or not, it doesn't matter, but if you remember, all the same issues come up. The main point there is that it doesn't help. But you don't need it to run the argument.
Yeah, no, that's good. And like part of the reason for these objections is to get the audience to understand it better, and just in case they have these objections in mind. Okay, so one more objection before we just turn it out. We're going to skip the grounding one, but I'm wondering about this objection maybe from a quantificational model of existence. So the pluralist might say that your argument assumes a quantificational model of existence, but there's disagreement even among pluralists about whether the logical machinery of quantification offers a good semantics, say, for exists. In other words, many pluralists criticize a model of existence on which we need to represent the properly categorical distinctness of entities that exist in different ways with distinct quantifiers. Pluralists such as Bill Vallicella and Barry Miller, for instance, have criticized quantificational models of existence. So the objection goes, surely then the pluralist can circumvent your argument by denying its implicit assumption of a quantificational model of existence. So what do you think of that?
I tried to give every argument in the paper, both in terms that use quantifiers and terms that didn't. In fact, right at the very beginning of the paper, I say, I want to engage in a debate that Scotus and Aquinas could have engaged in, Scotus being a monist, Aquinas being a pluralist, even though they aren't familiar with the quantificational apparatus of first order logic. So my own view is that I can and in fact do give all the arguments without using quantifiers at all. But I also give it using quantifiers partly because I do think it adds a kind of precision, at least for some people. If you're used to reading philosophy in a certain way, it's more precise and more concise for sure. And also because the kind of new versions or new discussions, more recent discussions of pluralism in McDaniel and Turner sometimes talk as if it's just is a view about which quantifiers are fundamental. I actually think that's a mistake because I think Aquinas and Scotus could be debating this issue and they weren't fighting about which quantifiers are fundamental. Mm-hmm. But I did want to show how what I would say kind of mapped on to those more contemporary discussions as well. And also, I mean, I'm a 21st century analytic philosopher. Quantifiers are freaking awesome.
Yes, exactly. No, I was going to say, like, if you didn't do it with quantifiers, I would have like struggled to follow it because it was so clear to me, like manipulating the symbols and so on. I was like, that makes perfect sense. I was definitely.
But I agree with the people that you stated. I think it's important to try and I personally think if you just say it's a fight about which backwards E quantifier is more fundamental than which, whether it's the one with the superscripts or the subscripts and one not, that can't really be it, because I would think, again, Scotus and Aquinas were disagreeing on these issues.
Yeah. Okay. Well, one last, and I'll do this one super quickly. I lied about that last one, but this one is truly last because you did mention it earlier, and I really wanted to come back to it. It's whether or not being is a genus. Now, I say a lot in here, but basically, it's saying that, like, hey, if monism is true, then everything enjoys generic existence. But in that case,
hang on. So just to be clear, yes, but also, if pluralism star is true, then everything enjoys generic existence.
Very true. Yeah.
So the kinds of pluralism that are the only that people seem to be defending against this argument are the kind that are also subject to this very complicated and special insight into what a genus is argument.
Yes, exactly. No, that's a good good addition. So basically, yeah, if monism is true, then everything, as well as pluralism star, then everything enjoys generic existence. But if that's true, then being or existence is univocal. But in that case, being is like a genus under which various of the kinds of things fall under. But being is not a genus, so the argument goes, so monism is false. Now, I just will very super briefly give some of the reasons why people think that being is not a genus. One reason is that like a genus in some sense can be added to, so you add like a specific difference that like demarcates the various species in the genus from one another. But so the thought goes, you can't add anything to being because there's nothing outside of being, as it were. You will only be able to add nothing, and nothing cannot serve as a specific difference.
You can add claims about a thing that are additional to the claim that it exists.
Exactly. That was my criticism down here. Okay.
So okay. All right. I'm sorry. I'll let you do your thing. I'm sorry.
So like, but yeah, I guess I basically, well, anyway, what are your general thoughts on this? And then I'll get into my criticism. Like I did say, because any genus admits of specific differences, the conceptual content of the genus, considered qua genus, can be supplemented with further conceptual content not included in the genus's conceptual content. But if that's how we're specifying this quote unquote adding to a genus, well, then being can obviously be added to, right? We can supplement the conceptual content of being with further conceptual content. And that doesn't imply that the only remaining conceptual content is that of non-being, right? It simply means that we're adding further conceptual specificity to the bare concept of being or existence to include, say, substance or attribute. Like, in addition to existing, it's also a substance, or it's also a human, or, those sorts of things. So that was my general worry. But what about you? Yeah.
That sounds great. I salute you. That sounds right. I also just want to point out that if this argument were good, then pluralism or not, it'd be false that everything enjoys generic existence. And if other parts of my paper that I don't think people seem to be objecting to were right, then we couldn't even state there is no Bigfoot, or Bigfoot doesn't exist. Yes. So for me, that makes me think there's something's got to be wrong here.
Yeah, no.
And maybe you're right about what's wrong here.
Yeah.
It's this idea of adding to that's super pictorial as opposed to, I mean, in one sense, X exists. We can add to that. X is an animal. That feels like that's an additional claim.
Mhm.
And if you're like, but that's not adding to in the right way, well, I don't know. Says who?
Says Aristotle. No, okay.
Okay, sorry, I forgot. Yeah, sorry.
No, no, that's interesting. Yeah, no, I like that. I like how you pointed out that, like, listen, your argument itself can constitute, like, in some sense, an objection to this kind of line of reasoning. It's like, well, listen, if this line of reasoning were successful, well, then you wouldn't even be able to state the view of pluralism, let alone accept it. And so, yeah, your objection itself constitutes an objection to this. So I think that was interesting. But I guess, as a concluding note, thank you everyone for listening. Thank you, Trenton, or not Trenton, Dr. Merricks. Thank you so much for coming. I really do appreciate it. And hey, everyone, if you enjoy this content, consider liking, subscribing. I'm a lowly college student, so you can support me on Patreon if you feel so inclined, if you see value in the work that I do. But yeah, do you have any final comments, Dr. Merricks?
No, but thanks. Thanks for reading my stuff.
Yeah, no, that was super fun. I love the paper and I love your other work as well. Everyone should go and check it out. Again, links are in the description. And what better way to end is there? Oh, and you can stick around, by the way, just for a little, so we just say goodbye. But now I'll say goodbye to the audience. So everyone, what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmidt. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.